The outer architecture of the building is typical Romanesque style, which Richardson favored. As you see, the many arches. The stone is from the Kibbe Quarry in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, which is the same stone which is in the early buildings of Smithsonian Institution. Architecturally, it's typical, I would say, European-style library with the barrel arch ceiling, barrel vault. Inside, we have solid oak. The ceiling is 29.5 feet high, solid white oak. All of the walls are also oak. And the furniture inside all was designed by Richardson and built by Davenport, A.H. Davenport of Malden, who was one of the foremost American designers of the 19th century. And in fact, we have the largest extant collection of that furniture of anywhere in its original setting, and over 130 pieces. And that's another duty we have to assume, is restoration of these tables and chairs. Be sure that they don't get sold or thrown away or replaced with the new modernistic pressboard type things. In fact, at some point, I know I've read all the annual reports going back to 1879, and at some point they saw that some of the pieces of that original gate were in the trash. Somebody had just destroyed the whole thing and thrown it out. So we've had a replica made of it. The building also has 2 towers, and the only bit of color on the outside of the building below the dragon downspout on the wall, and it's a little bit of green. That's the only bit of color that's used on the outside of the building. Now we're standing in Memorial Hall, as it was called originally. This was the library when the library opened in 1885. And going back and looking through all of this, you'll see the carvings, the work in these columns, which is so typical of Richardson designs, the vine leaves, ivy, the balusters and the railing on the balcony. Each baluster is different from each other, or several. They're not all the same. Again, that's so typical of Richardson. And here, these have all been restored. This is all original Richardson Davenport furniture, all been restored. And that bust down there, which is the artist Ipsen, I-P-S-E-N, Malden artist, who designed the gates, the front gates to the Salem Street entrance. When I first came, all the reading was done at that table, which is in the fireplace alcove. In the balcony, we did not allow people to go up there because it was rather dangerous, we thought, and also that part of the balcony actually sagged, and a few years ago I got a grant to get those 2 columns made, which are the only part of the furnishings of this library which are not the original. And we had those 2 columns made to shore up the balcony so that we could use it without fear or trepidation. But all the rest of it is original except for the gate and those 2 columns. As you can see, there's this beautiful fireplace and ingle nook, typical Victorian architecture. And I'll have to tell you that when I first came here, we used to put in sometimes those phony logs, and it looked as if you had a fire, and people would pull chairs up just even if there was no heat, but they loved sitting in front of the fireplace. And in this room, this was where people sat, particularly young high school students who were studying, who had told their parents, well, I'm going to the library. And of course, the studying was a nice blind date or a prearranged date. They used to meet in the library because it was safe so far as their parents knew, and it was safe actually for the kids. And they might have gotten some studying done as well. We have some very, very good authors who grew up in Malden. For instance, Earl Stanley Gardner, who did use this library. And at some point, I'm sure he sat at one of these tables. And he, of course, wrote the Perry Mason series. And he was, until very, very recent times, the all-time best-selling American author. And then we had Eliot Paul, who was a gourmand and also a raconteur. His book, The Last Time I Saw Paris, was the first #1 book on the New York Times list when it originated. We had the late John O'Brien, who was a teacher at Malden High School, who was also in charge of the Dramatic Society at Malden High, and did a lot of work in this library, did a lot of work for this library, did many, many presentations, and also he wrote a lot of one-act plays, many of which were also presented outside of Malden. I saw some of them done in Boston. The first two additions to this building were designed by the successor firm of Richardson's, and only the very latest, the one in 1995, was designed by different architects. When I started doing the restoration work in this building, we had one original chandelier, which was designed by H.H. Richardson, and we had these replicas made. And we had one original sconce, and we also had replicas made, and they were, of course, originally all gas fixtures. This is the painting of Malden, England, given to us some years back, I think when the Lord Mayor of Malden came here back in the 1930s or 40s. I wasn't here, believe it or not. Anyway, it was given to us as a gift. And Malden, I've never been to Malden, England. I haven't yet. I will visit. And I know it's in the Essex part, the eastern part of England. I know where it is, but I will have to visit. And it's Maldon in the Old Country. Through the years, this library has been very, very fortunate with really very generous donors, especially in the early days when people would give us something like this, 18th century clock, and the other clock, which you probably will see later, is by Simon Willard, and this one is by John Sullivan Gordon, 1766. Also, we got a gift of a painting of Alvin T. Fuller, who was a governor of Massachusetts in the 1920s. And he started in Malden, was born in Malden, and had a bicycle shop. And eventually he became one of the first importers of automobiles and sold automobiles, and had that big agency in Brookline, which people remember, the Cadillac agency, for many, many years. And it was given to us by his son, Peter Fuller, and told us that that painting is even better than the one that they have in the State House of his father as governor. These statues were stored in the library's cellar during World War II because people were worried about possible air raids. They were there until I got a grant from probably the Arts Council, and I said, and we had the statues cleaned. A few years later, we got a grant from somewhere else, and we had the statues brought up, but we couldn't bring up the pedestals. It was so heavy, they needed professional movers. And then some years ago, Mr. Wilfred Carr, a former trustee, gave us money to have the pedestals brought upstairs. That one weighs more than 1,000 pounds. So now we have the statues back where they belong, mostly, more or less. So some of the statues are in what was the statuary room when the library opened. And again, those were all gifts from the early donors. This painting of the old philosopher was one of the early paintings that Mr. Converse himself gave us. And the Converses in the early days also gave money to begin a fund to purchase art. And when Mrs. Converse died, 1904, They gave $15,000 in her memory to add to the art fund. And then later, one of their daughters, Ida Converse, also gave money for the art fund. And that's been built up through the years, along with other donations. And when the income reaches a certain level and the trustees' art committee sees a painting that it thinks it would fit into the gallery, we purchase a piece of art. But this is all because of the murder of that young man in 1863. This painting by Paul Thomas, or I suppose Thomas, is where it was in its original place in 1885 when the library was opened to the public. The Women of the Conquered, the Vanquished, and it won the first prize at the Paris Salon of 1884 and came to us in 1885. This is the 1897 edition. Here we have mostly paintings by Malden artists, including the Gettysburg Address by Albion Bicknell. We had a letter some years back from the National Park Service saying that it was the only painting of the Gettysburg Address. But of course, it's not really Lincoln at Gettysburg, because there's an oriental rug on the floor, and also the people who were there, including Frederick Douglass, are only there in the artist's eye, and General Grant certainly wasn't there at that time. I think he was busy with other things, but it's a nice painting. I wish we could try to take it out and how it's done. It's on chains and pulleys, and it will come out. It's like an old-fashioned movie where something comes out from the wall or somebody comes out from the wall. But we were told it was probably too fragile to even try to open it up. This particular painting, I always liked. It's French, but it always reminds me of Old Atlantic Avenue in Boston. You see people selling fish on the street, and actually on the sidewalk, because fish are on the sidewalk. See the beautiful reflection of pigeons, people in those puddles. So it really is a great painting. And that's another painting by George Loring Brown, Malden artist, just called Venice. He did many, many paintings of Venice. And on the other wall, we have some more paintings by George Loring Brown of Venice. This is one of our latest acquisitions by Malden artist Ernest Ibsen, whose bust we saw downstairs. But that's just called Mr. Lance and Bottles. And when we first got it, I kept looking for the bottles, but I didn't see them. And what it is, it's the dog's name. But I love that painting because to me, it could be anybody's grandfather. It makes you feel happy and safe looking at that picture. At least for me, that's what it does. Ernest L. Ibsen was also born in Malden. He was very well known as a portrait painter, a contemporary of Sargent and often compared to Sargent. And he was born in Malden of Danish parentage and studied here, but also studied in Copenhagen for a while, and quite well known in the late 19th century. He was also part of the large artistic community which existed in Malden, late 19th, early 20th century. So he's another one of our famous painters. We had quite a few. This painting called The Uniform was given to us anonymously some years ago, and it's painted by Darius Cobb, he and his twin brother Cyrus were born in the parsonage, the first parish, the old parsonage on Main Street, which is where Adoniram Judson, the famous missionary to Burma who translated the Bible into Burmese, also was born. And Darius and Cyrus were both painters, and Cyrus was known also as an eminent sculptor. But they both served in the Civil War in the 44th Massachusetts Regiment, and Cyrus has done the Soldiers' Monument in Cambridge Commons. They were descendants of Elder Cobb, who came to America on the second voyage of the Mayflower. And their mother was a Waite, W-A-I-T-E, a very famous name in Malden history. So it's very interesting to have this painting. I'm so glad that the person who gave it to us anonymously did think of us when he made a gift. We're in the Ryder Gallery now, which was the 1916 addition to the library, the second edition. And fortunately, this skylight was never covered. As you can see, it's still there. And this is a beautiful octagonal room. And I certainly would have to start with a very important thing that happened in this room. And it was right there where our Winslow Homer painting was hanging. And on July 30, 1975, it was stolen. And that was the same day that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. So we shared headlines with Jimmy Hoffa. Our painting was recovered. Jimmy never was. But anyway, before the painting was restored, we would get pictures of the painting itself on a bed, showing that it still hadn't been, nothing had happened to it. It was still the painting, and that these people really had it. We worked with the insurance investigator a lot of this, and we'd get crazy phone calls. Well, I know what the painting is, you know, and you're going to get it back within 2 days, things like that. It was recovered at Government Center in Boston, and we were standing right out there. Harry Reinhertz, who was the president of the trustees at the time, and the Mr. Bradley, who had just recently restored that particular painting, so he was there to authenticate it. And the state police and the district attorney's office had cameras all around at CS Crescent and around Government Center Plaza, filming the whole thing. And so we're sitting there, and the man comes with the shopping bag. The painting had been taken out of the frame, and he's carrying it right to us and taken out of the bag. And Mr. Bradley looked at it and said, yes, this is the painting. So money was exchanged, and they walked off. And then we went up to the district attorney's office, Assistant District Attorney Thomas Dwyer, and we could hear everything. The man had gone up Cambridge Street to Harvard Gardens, the restaurant some of you know, across from Mass General Hospital, and was sitting there in a booth with 2 others, and they were talking about things. We heard the whole conversation. But anyway, he was the go-between. Finally, after the painting was restored to us, He went to jail, I think, for 6 months, that's all, but it was never discovered who really planned it. We think it was Miles Connor. When they finally said that we could have it back, and we got it back after paying the ransom, we were told not to give any information because they had the Rembrandt, which had been stolen from the MFA at that time, and they said they would burn it or damage it if we gave out any information about our painting, and we didn't. Then I think in November of that year they returned that painting, probably for money as well, and then we could tell the whole story of what had happened. But anyway, I love that story because when I travel and I'm on a plane and somebody says to me, "Well, what do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'm a librarian." And then the eyes glaze because they think, here's the old lady stamping books all day. But it's a lifesaver for me because it certainly changes the librarian's image. And then people say, "Oh, I didn't know librarians did anything like that." But here, as you can see, we do have a beautiful collection. This painting by Jerome just returned from the Getty Museum and the d'Orsay Museum in Paris, and then a museum called Thyssen something in Barcelona, Spain. And it's been all over the world. It's also been to Japan in the past. It's been to other museums. And that right now probably is our most important painting. These two paintings on top are of two Tufts, a husband and wife, and they were painted by an unknown artist, which is typical of that era, 18th century, where they just used the same bodies for every painting and just painted the person's face. So you'll see a lot of paintings similar to that. And the little girl in the middle is Doris Burdick, painted by her father, Horace Burdick, who was another Malden artist. They lived right up the street from here. Two paintings are of a mother and daughter from New York who were part of beer people. In fact, the daughter married a Ballantine. And they're by Ernest Ibsen, and the ones that people think are very similar to what Sargent did. And below them are some statues by Erte, a very famous Art Deco artist, which we purchased some years ago. And on this wall is some other Malden artist, Stanley Woodard, and that's a painting on the Cape. And the one in the middle, the Bradford, in the lee of the iceberg. Bradford was one of the most famous painters of icebergs and Arctic scenes, and was a lifesaver for me before air conditioning. I used to come in here and look at it to cool off. Now this is the newest edition, 1995. We had to raise $6 million to build this, not one penny of city money. We unfortunately had to sell 3 of our major paintings. We did manage to raise $2 million, but that was it, and then we couldn't raise any more than that. So we had a bond out, which we paid for 10 years, and then after 10 years you could buy it back if you wanted. And we decided at that time to sell one more painting so we could buy it back. So then this was done. I hope that whoever comes to replace me will love this library as much as I have loved it, and others have loved it. And I think that you need a person, a younger person certainly, that wouldn't be difficult, a young person who has some of the new ideas in librarianship. I just wish that that person and the people of his or her staff will do as good a job as the staffs we've had have done. I really do. I think that this is one of the best libraries in Massachusetts, always has been, and I think that they deserve a lot of credit. It's been a very, very welcoming community, and it's been a very interesting community in many, many ways, and make some enemies along the way, but that's part of life. One of the old-time expressions was, you have to learn to roll with the punches, which I do. or I have done so far. I've been asked several times what I plan to do when I retire, and I plan to take some courses, probably at Harvard Extension, which is where I got my undergraduate degree, but things I didn't have time for, things like art history and classical music. And I also plan to learn how to play the clarinet, and I have threatened the trivia people that I will come back next year and play for them. And then I decided, well, no, that's probably very good. I could have Paul auction off, and whoever bids the highest, I will stop. When the library opened, there was a gate between where people could sit and read, which is the area we're in now, and where the books were shelved, that a patron could not go in and take a book off the shelf. He had to ask the librarian who was sitting behind this gate to retrieve a book that he wanted if it were on the shelf. But at that time, it was really quite a privilege for someone to be able to use the library. And then when he or she came in, he couldn't even get to the books themselves. So libraries have changed. They really have.